The last day of the week, the last PFT PM until next week. I was off yesterday getting my annual physical. Everything went fine as far as I know. Blood work is the key. And there's actually a test now where you can find out whether or not you have cancer well before you have symptoms. And I don't want to drag this down before we actually get it started, but if you're ever going to know that you have it, it's better to know as soon as possible. For example, pancreatic cancer, typically you don't know you have it until it's too late. If you could find that you have it when there are microscopic changes to your blood and they somehow pick up the cancer marker in this blood test, and I hope it's actually a legitimate and real thing and not just a whole lot of money for nothing, but you got a much better chance of beating it the sooner you know you have it. That's why I'm always a big advocate in getting your physicals, getting colonoscopies, doing the cancer screening things that will tell you as soon as you possibly can know whether or not you have something like that, because the earlier you know, the earlier you start on treatment, the better equipped you will be to survive and thrive for the rest of your life. So that was yesterday in a very hazy Pittsburgh, where the air quality from the Canadian wildfires was even worse than it is here. There's a weird smell I noticed last night. It's kind of burning wood. It's kind of burning plastic. I didn't notice it until I came out of my barn last night, which is odd because there was burning tobacco leaf. And yes, it was only tobacco in the barn. And when I walked out, I noticed that smell, that funky smell from the Canadian wildfires. So I don't know how much longer it's going to last, but apparently it's going to be around, and it's just going to kind of hover across different parts of the country until those fires go out, and they don't expect them to go out until the wintertime. By then, I don't expect the Tyreek Hill situation with the Miami Dolphins, the latest incident involving him, to be resolved, but there continues to be developments. The latest report yesterday from Fox Sports 640 that the NFL has commenced an investigation into this latest incident. Father's Day, South Florida Marina. Tyreek Hill allegedly hit a man on the neck. There are accounts of what happened. He supposedly, reportedly, allegedly was on a boat with some others. The captain told him to get off. There were words exchanged, profanities hurled. Hill allegedly tried to rush this boat captain, but then it was a different employee, 57-year-old man who works at the marina or on one of the boats, got in the vicinity of Hill and allegedly got struck on the neck. And the surveillance footage, per the police report, shows the incident. The NFL wants the surveillance footage. It wants to talk to the police officers. It's doing what it should be doing. Anytime the NFL is on notice of an incident that potentially violates the personal conduct policy, the NFL has to investigate it. Otherwise, what's the point? You can't just look the other way. You can't just choose to not investigate. Oh, it doesn't sound like a big deal. We won't look into it. They need to look into it. They need to decide what happened. And then they need to eventually decide whether or not a punishment is in order. Now, here's the reality. The NFL has developed a habit in recent years of not proceeding with a personal conduct policy investigation and or punishment if there's a criminal process that is still active. That's why when over the weekend it was reported that Davante Adams' criminal case had been dismissed, arising from shoving an ESPN staffer after a Monday Night Football game, and we all saw it. There's no need to wait for the surveillance footage. But once that process ends, that's when the NFL can step in and activate the personal conduct policy. Adams is now on the clock. Hill won't be, as long as there is a criminal investigation. Now, who knows where this is going to go? If it's anything, it's a misdemeanor. But the alleged victim is motivated to pursue charges. There could be litigation. And there apparently will be something by way of investigation done by the NFL. The one thing to remember, if the league decides this is something that rises to the level of a punishment under the personal conduct policy, Hill's history is an enhancement to the punishment. Now, if the league decides nothing, there's no reason to enhance it. But if the league decides there was something, that's when the guilty plea from 2015 to choking and punching his then pregnant girlfriend becomes relevant. And also remember, we learned last year, there's a new process for ultimately setting the punishment. Judge Sue Robinson, remember her from 2022 in the Deshaun Watson case? She has the first cut at this, and then the league can appeal it to the league. The commissioner has final say, but there are things that Judge Sue L. Robinson can do that will make it harder for the league to dramatically change the final outcome. But that's all down the road. For now, the thing to remember is the league is investigating, the criminal process continues, and the league won't be doing anything most likely until the criminal process ends. People are already worried about week 1, Dolphins, Chargers. That won't be an issue. And I'd be surprised if it's an issue if there's a suspension that's finalized and implemented at any point in 2022. This is a 2023 problem for Tyreek Hill, and we'll continue to monitor it as the developments happen and as the NFL does or doesn't do anything with it. Gambling policy continues to be front and center for the NFL, and I think we've now reached the end of what I'll call phase 1 of gambling policy enforcement, because now that we've had 10 total players who have been suspended for violating the gambling policy, 7 for betting on pro football, the other 3 for betting on other sports while at work, even if it was reportedly for Jameson Williams of the Lions in a hotel while on the road. 10 players, going back to Calvin Ridley, have been suspended. At this point, no player in the NFL can say, I don't know and didn't know there's a rule regarding gambling. They should all know at this point. Now, do they truly know the contours? Do they understand what they can and can't do? Do they accept and submit to the rule? That's another issue. But let's assume they all know what the rule is. They're all in a position where they have the resources available to them. When in doubt, ask someone a question. I was curious, for example, in the aftermath of last night's golf event with Travis Kelce and Patrick Mahomes taking on Steph Curry and Klay Thompson, the match. I asked the NFL, hey, just to be clear, is this something that players would have been allowed to bet on? It involves NFL players. Well, players can bet on it. It's only when it's an NFL event. Games, obviously. Draft picks, who's going to be drafted where. Pro Bowl games are part of it. If anyone's betting on who runs through the obstacle course faster. Honors at the end of the season. Who's the MVP, who's the offensive player of the year, etc. But if it's NFL players involved in non-NFL events, it's fair game. Now, presumably, if the NFL would ever decide to have some late June phony competition golf match or 2-on-2 basketball or whatever, that would make it an NFL event, presumably. But that's kind of where the rubber meets the road here, and it's important that the players understand. And I've suggested maybe a hotline where any player could contact, either by voice or by text or email even, a joint NFL-NFLPA service that would tell them whether or not a proposed bet is proper. That would be the best and most effective way if the players would use it. But at this point, because I think to this point, the league has done a poor job of educating players. Teams have not, in some cases, properly supplemented what the league has done. I believe the league's motivation has been to get signatures on acknowledgement forms, not make sure the players truly understand the rule. I think the league has been bogged down by the hypocrisy of stuffing their pockets full of money from sportsbook sponsorships and allowing owners to hold equity in sportsbook companies. They understand they're in a difficult spot. It impairs their ability to give that full-throated, this is what you are prohibited from doing. And I still would submit that the best outcome for the NFL would be to have an epiphany here, that we don't need the gambling money. Things are fine. We're making ends meet without grabbing more money for nothing from associating our logos and names with sportsbook companies. We're fine there. We're going to slam the door on gambling. We're going to build a firewall because it's going to make it easier for us to have the moral authority to go to the players and say, you can't bet on anything. On anything. No gambling on sports until your career is over, period. It's easier to do that if the NFL can also say we are making not a single penny, directly or indirectly, from gambling. If they would do that, it would go a long way toward making it easier for them to have that ability without issues of hypocrisy and inconsistency and fairness dragging down the NFL's effort. And that leads to the comment that was made last night by Jonathan Jones of the Patriots. Jonathan Jones said on Twitter, I understand rules are rules, but I can risk my life so that my team wins, but I can't risk $1,000 on my team winning. And I got to thinking, and look, part of what I'm doing here is trying to just demonstrate how ridiculous and inconsistent this all is and how hard it is for the NFL to have that true moral authority to enforce its own rules. But if this entire ban on gambling flows from a desire to preserve and protect the integrity of the game, what about betting on your team to win affects the integrity of the game? You play to win the game, as Herm Edwards once famously said. Every team is trying to win every game, every time. The NFL tells us that when the question of tanking comes up. Everybody's always trying to win. Winning, 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 winning. Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. Now, preseason, that's a different issue, and I would not endorse any conversation about players betting on their teams to win in the preseason. I'm talking about regular season and postseason, and not point spread bets. Because if you're favored to win by 10 and your team's up by 7 late, and you've got guys who bet on their team giving 10, and the coach all of a sudden says, take an E, and the players are like, we'd like to score 4 more points here. That's a problem. But a straight money line wager, Patriots to win. What about a Patriots to win bet affects the integrity of the game for a Patriots player who is already trying to win the game? And it's amazing how many people have lost their minds about this argument. It's a very simple argument, and it's rooted in common sense. They are already playing to win the game. What undermines the integrity of the game if you allow a player who is participating in the game, who is already trying to win the game, to bet on his team winning the game? How does it affect the integrity of anything? And I raise this point because it just demonstrates the flaws in the logic, the flaws in the thinking, the flaws in the approach. Because there is no impact on the integrity of the game. And you get a lot of, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? What about this? Well, given that Big Brother that everyone is carrying around is the thing that provides the real-time evidence to the NFL about who is and who isn't, and it may not be happening in real time, but ultimately it is the evidence about who's betting on other sports at work, who's betting on NFL games anywhere. If you allow the players who are on a given team to make a money line wager on that team to win, you know it, you track it, you see it, the sports books see it. Anything beyond that, you're violating the policy. You're getting dangerously close to the line, but you can't do anything more than that. You can do that, but you can't do anything else. And when you look at some of the things that Roger Goodell said back in 2009 when the NFL was fighting tooth and nail against Delaware's effort to take down the federal law that ultimately was taken down by New Jersey 8 years later, that opened the floodgates for state-by-state legalized wagering programs, there's nothing in his comments that would say it's an affront to the integrity of the game for a player who is playing on a team that's trying to win to bet on his team to win as a money line proposition. Nothing else would be allowed, but that should be fine. People have said, well, they have access to inside information. What is the inside information if you're betting on your team to win the game as a money line wager? What's the inside information? Hey, guys, I got a secret plan for this week's game. Here it is. Don't tell anybody. We're going to try to score more points than the other team. Shh. That's the plan. There's no inside information in that. They're trying to win the game. They want to score more points than the other team. Well, a player making a bet would show that he has more confidence than. The point is this. This whole thing is rife with hypocrisy. The NFL is finding a way to talk out of both sides of its mouth. Do as we say, not as we do. And I think examples like this demonstrate that the right thing for the league to do is just build that firewall and say, we're not taking the money. We're not going to let owners have equity interest in sports books are going to have to divest, or they're going to have to sell their teams. Remember, the Rooneys went through that 15 years ago or thereabouts, where their legal gambling interests that were permissible under league rules began to stray beyond what the league allowed. And the league said, hey, you got to make a choice here. You got to divest or you got to sell. And the league was, and I remember other teams were very upset that the league was way too patient with the Rooneys, waited way too long to force the Rooneys to fix this. Eventually, members of the Rooney family got out of the Steelers business and stayed in the gambling that violated the gambling policy at the time, whether it was slot machines, video lottery, video poker, whatever. There was something that was being added to their legal, within the eyes of the NFL, gambling interests that crossed the line, and the league eventually forced the Rooneys' hand, and some of the Rooneys chose the gambling over owning the team. So my point is this. For sports wagering, the only way that the NFL can send a clear and obvious message to the players that they should not do it, and I submit that the rule should be players should not be betting on any sports whatsoever, just like non-players. I still don't know why players are allowed to do it. It's not collectively bargained. The league just decided to let them do it. Why? Is the Chris Sims theory accurate that the sports books just want some whales, some young rich guys with a lot of disposable income and some free time on their hands 6 months out of the year, where they're sitting at home watching basketball? Hey, DraftKings app, FanDuel app, boom, 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 drop 1,000, drop 5,000, drop 10,000, whatever. Is that why players are allowed to bet on other sports? To help the sports books make some of the money back that they're giving to the NFL? Wouldn't it be better for everyone if the rule was players just can't bet on sports? It would be nice to have someone answer that question. Why? And I don't know that I've specifically asked the league that question. I think I'm going to. Why are players, how did this happen? That players in the NFL's exercise of its unilateral power under the management rights clause via the integrity of the game, gambling policy, the union just sits back and says, it's fine. No bargaining necessary. Do whatever you want. Why did the NFL decide to let players bet on other sports when non-players can't? Anyway, this all becomes cleaner and clearer and easier for everyone if the league would just say, we're out of the gambling business altogether. The problem is the league is trying to have it both ways. Now, if we have completed phase one of the NFL's coexistence with gambling, and players now fully know, they should have known a long time ago, but now they fully know what the policy is, what it allows, what it doesn't. Let's assume they all know. What's phase two? I've got some ideas as to what phase two could be, whether it's phase two, phase three, phase four. A next phase will be, what do you do about the guys who arrive in the NFL with a gambling addiction? What do you do about those guys? Guys who, from the moment they turned 18 or whatever the minimum age is, I assume it's 18, and started gambling on their phones. They developed an addiction in college, the college regulatory process. And I don't know what the rules are for college players. Can they bet on NFL games? I don't know. It's not my jurisdiction. I'm curious about it now. Are NCAA players allowed to legally wager on NFL games while they're in college playing college football? If they are, and there'd be no reason for them not to be, they develop an addiction to gambling on the NFL, and then they arrive in the NFL. What do? How do you help those kids? Do you try to identify them in advance and help them and give them treatment? Or do you just wait for them to screw up and hold up their head as the latest example of what happens when you run afoul of the gambling rules? So that's an issue. How do they deal with addiction? Another issue, and this is an example of how it becomes much harder for the NFL to enforce its policies when the evidence isn't just falling into its lap. The 10 suspensions they've imposed, my assumption, based upon everything I've seen and heard, is that all of that evidence came straight from the sports books. NFL just sits back. The sports books blow the whistle. And I've had people say, well, how is this fair? How is this proper? How are they allowed to do it? I think the regulatory bodies have some say in it. I think there is some obligation out there in situations like this where you have people who are subject to these kinds of rules. If they're betting, the information has to be made available. And that's another thing that we now know. Your phone will rat you out. FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM will rat you out. They presumably can do so legally. But now that we know that you can't use this thing to bet on the NFL, you can't use this thing to bet on other sports when you're at work, the smart guys will find other people to bet for them. What will the NFL ever do to investigate and enforce that? Isn't that easy? Spouse, girlfriend, friend, associate, cousin, uncle, family member, a guy that the player just happens to meet somewhere and strike up a conversation with and say, hey, do you like to make a little extra money? Place these bets for me. I'll give you the cash. You make the bets. You get to keep X percentage of the winnings. What do they do to spot that guy who's smart enough to beat the current system? Because you have to worry about that. See, my opinion has been that the NFL kind of likes that these suspensions are happening because it allows the NFL to create the impression for the world that their policy works because they're catching guys who violate it. And again, what effort does it take? The challenge is spotting the guys who are smart enough to not bet on their own phones in their own names and who set up someone else to do it for them. Remember when, and Ross Tucker recently reminded me of this, because there's been thought of, a more aggressive effort via what used to be the rookie symposium to make sure the incoming players understand gambling properly and what they can and can't do. Remember when Chris Carter mentioned that everyone needs to have a fall guy? I mean, that becomes your gambling fall guy. You find someone else who isn't subject to the gambling policy who's allowed to do it. It's not even a fall guy. There's no one to fall. There's nothing to trip over. It's perfectly legal for someone other than the player to make those bets. It's against the policy for the player to be financing those bets and collecting the winnings. What will the NFL do to prevent that from happening? Because you know what? And hey, if I'm going to be one of Howie Roseman's top 5 NFL conspiracy theorists, I have to continue to hold my position. I would suspect that's already happening. Wouldn't you? Do you want a spot in the top 5 with me? Wouldn't you believe that already smart players are using other people to make their bets? Wouldn't you believe that's happening? Wouldn't you believe that some smart non-players are using other people to make their bets? It's an easy fix. If you're smart, if you're discreet, if you use a burner phone, how are they ever going to prove it? How are they ever going to begin to have the resources in place to prove it? What are they going to do? I mean, it's one thing to have FanDuel, DraftKings, BetMGM, et cetera, just hand you the information of the guys who have violated the policy. It's another thing to track down people's phones, digital footprints, and who they know and who they're talking to. The other issue, too, that we now see from the Isaiah Rodgers suspension, the report that one of his wagers was $1,000 on a teammate's over-under for rushing yards. We assume, I don't assume anything in this setting. The guy either bet over or under. Oh, don't you believe in your teammate? You bet the over if you believe in your teammate. Well, it's not a matter of believing in the teammate or not believing in the teammate. It's a matter of knowing what the game plan is. It has nothing to do with the ability of the player. It has everything to do with the opportunities the player will get in that game and Isaiah Rodgers' knowledge of those opportunities from being in practice all week, from having access to the game plan, the meetings, the discussions, the conversations. If you're part of that bubble, there's a lot of stuff you know. Now, Isaiah Rodgers foolishly used it for his own wager. One of the next frontiers for the NFL as it relates to gambling is what systems do you put in place to ensure that inside information is being properly handled and to catch those who are mishandling it. Think of all the information that is available to a player over the course of a week, of all the meetings, all the practices, the game plans, the film study, everything. By the end of the week, the night before the game, that player has a wealth of information that can be tapped into by anyone. How many players currently are actively supplying inside information to others for money? I don't know. Are there any? Does it take a top 5 conspiracy theorist to at least consider maybe there are players out there who aren't betting, have no desire to bet, but they have in their possession a marketable asset, material, non-public information regarding their team's plans for the next game. And it can be anything. It could be anything. The teams that script the first 15 plays, who knows those? Just the general approach that week. We're going to go run heavy. We're going to go pass heavy. Our defense is going to focus on taking away the run. They're going to be able to pass. Our defense is going to focus on taking away the pass. They're going to be able to run. It can be an entire universe of information. You can have a player who has a contact who that player calls the night before every game and just downloads everything he knows. Do you think that's already happening? I don't know, but I think it will. May not be happening now, but I think it will. And I think the NFL better be concerned about it. Because what I'm trying to do is identify the potential pitfalls, the things that could happen that could crash the NFL. Not completely, but just diminish it. You don't need. Now, look, short term, would we benefit as an outlet that covers the NFL from a Tim Donaghy type scandal? You bet. Long term, does it help the NFL if there's a scandal like that? And I mentioned Tim Donaghy just because that resonates. We immediately think NBA officiating scandal. Do we want there to be a name that is forever associated with that scandal or this scandal or that scandal? And it's not just point shaving. It's not just fixing games. I think that's harder to do in the NFL. And the NFL has reconciled itself with that reality. But inside information, selling it, using it, abusing it, NFL needs to be very concerned about that. Last topic for today before I answer a few questions. The NFLPA Executive Director vote. We came back and did a special little addendum to Wednesday's PFT PM after it was known that Lloyd Howell, a person I had never heard of, and most people in the NFL ecosystem had never heard of before he was announced as a new NFLPA Executive Director. When that came out, we did a little on that. On Wednesday, there was a press conference with members of the media asking questions both of Howell and of Union President J.C. Tretter. And I continue to have some questions about the process. And I understand it's not my business directly, but it's my business indirectly because, as I've said before, it's important for any of the stakeholders in the game of professional football to care about the balance that exists or doesn't exist between management and labor. If it gets too far out of balance, it sets the stage for a work stoppage, and we don't want a work stoppage. We want that thing that we cover to continue to exist. I remember during the pandemic when we were trying to understand and explain the rules and offer opinions on what should or shouldn't be the rules, people were like, oh, you don't want there to be a season. Yeah, you're right. You're right, Einstein. I don't want there to be a football season when my only business is to cover football. I don't want them to play games. No, I don't want that. I want the games to be played. I don't want work stoppages. I don't want any stoppages. I want every game to be played. I want to be able to cover the sport of football. So I have an interest in making sure that the union has the best possible executive director who can go toe-to-toe with the commissioner and the owners. And Lloyd Howell could be it. But the problem is the union leadership so excessively prioritized confidentiality that I think they threw their process out of balance. And as best I could understand J.C. Tretter's comments from the press conference, they didn't want undue external influence over the process. They didn't want media outlets endorsing candidates. They didn't want guys like me chiming in on why you should like this guy or not like this guy, or these are the questions you should ask if you're a player rapper. These are the concerns you should be interested in. They didn't want that. They wanted to do it themselves. The problem in limiting undue external influence, they minimized internal influence. And specifically, they consolidated that influence to the executive committee, multiple members of which are retired players. One of the things Tretter expressed multiple times during the press conference, this was a decision by players. I don't know whether he said by players, for players, but that was the message. This is a player-led union. The executive committee picked the candidates, vetted the candidates, created the list of finalists, dropped it into the laps of the Board of Player Representatives earlier this week. They changed the Constitution so that the player representatives didn't have the names at least 30 days before the meeting. They did that last year. They set this up. They knew what they were going to do. We're going to create an ultra-secret process where no one knows. Here's our goal. Here's our goal. And look, I think in very linear fashion. I think football players are very linear. Here's our goal. We got to go. Confidentiality equals good. So we're going to do everything we can to get as much confidentiality as possible. So let's create a system where no one knows who the finalists will be until the very last minute. Yeah, that'll keep those jerks in the media from trying to butt in our affairs. That's fine. That's fine. But what it also does, it creates a system where your board of player reps show up and they don't know who the hell these people are. And see, Tretter was asked that question. And he said, well, it's not for them to vet. It's for the executive committee to vet. That's fine. But if you're going to say this is a player-run process, you got to get all the retired players off the executive committee. And you definitely got to remove from the executive committee, I don't know, any players that may currently work for the NFL or currently work for Amazon. Those guys shouldn't be involved in vetting the candidates and whittling down the list to a couple of finalists who just get dropped into the laps of the Board of Player Representatives. See, there's a lot of problems here. And there aren't many of us in the media who care about it. I do. Because something stinks to me about all of it. The process creates suspicion. That's the other flaw in this thinking. They were so obsessed with confidentiality. They didn't think that to the outside, and Tretter tried to dismiss it as, well, we know you guys need some stories to write in the slow time. So you would have liked to have, the fans don't give a shit, JC. 99% of my readers don't care about this. News of who the executive director finalists were going to be was not going to move the needle at PFT, I can guarantee that. And the stories I've been writing this week are not moving the needle, but I think it's the right thing to do to make sure the players understand what's happening and to ensure that the proper balance exists between labor and management. So a question I posed recently, now that someone knows who the finalists were, the Board of Player Reps know, the confidentiality supposedly expired when they showed up and got the names, are the other players who were kept in the dark. The rank and file was kept in the dark. They used their apathy against them because that's the problem with the NFLPA. The rank and file don't care. So when the rank and file don't care, you can create a system where, and I don't know how they arrived at Lloyd Howell. I don't know who the other finalists were. I don't know how many there were. I don't know anything about the process, but neither do the members of the union. Now that the dust has settled, will their curiosity result in them contacting their representatives, the men they've elected, and say, who else was up for that? I'm just curious. I'm just curious. Like, I know we picked Lloyd Howell, and this is a guy with no union background. He was in corporate America for 34 years. He's on the board of GE Healthcare, which has some pretty close ties to the NFL. This Booz Allen Hamilton firm did some work for the NFL teams, some of the teams back in the first decade of this century. We just want to know who else was in the running. Just curious. I'm just curious. I'm curious about it. Is there curiosity among the players? See, union leadership banked on the fact that there isn't. There wasn't enough curiosity ahead of time. The Board of Player Representatives, for whatever reason, last year, and I'd love to know more about the amendment that changed the Constitution to ensure extreme secrecy. I've asked the union for it multiple times. They have not told me yet, yes or no, whether or not I'm going to get it. I'd love to see the amendment or other amendments, because the statement from the union says that they followed the Constitution and all relevant board amendments. There was an S on the end of it. What other amendments were there? So, again, most of you don't care. I'm trying to explain why you should care, and definitely why players out there who have allowed the union to be co-opted by the fact that the players don't care. And if the players cared a little bit more or at all, this wouldn't have happened. This secret process that resulted in the election of Lloyd Howell would not have occurred. People would have known and had an opportunity to chime in and explore the qualifications in the background and ask the tough questions. Is this something we really want? Someone with ties to GE Healthcare, given GE Healthcare's ties to the NFL, does that help us? Does it hurt us? Do we want someone who worked at a consulting firm that did work for the NFL teams? Does that help us or does it hurt us? Does it help us understand the way the NFL thinks when it's time to negotiate the next CBA, or does it hurt us? And, here's the other reality. It's 2023. The current CBA lasts until the end of the decade and into the next decade. I don't even know how old Lloyd Howell is. He worked at Booz Allen Hamilton for 34 years. He's got an engineering degree from Penn and an MBA from Harvard. So, again, unless we're dealing with a Doogie Howser situation, he's probably my age, if not older. Let's say he got his MBA at 23. You add 34 to that, he's my age. And I'd like to think that I'll still be doing what I'm doing early into the next decade, but I don't know. And again, hey, look, this is not an ageist thing. I think people over the age of 40, over the age of 50, over the age of 60, over the age of 70, over the age of 80 can contribute much. My question is, how long does Lloyd Howell really intend to be there? What kind of a contract is he going to get? Is he a bridge to the executive director they'll hire in advance of the next CBA? Is this just a peacetime executive director, knowing that they're going to ramp up later with somebody who will be prepared for the next CBA negotiations? I don't know. There's a lot of things I'm curious about. And again, most of you don't care, but I'm trying to give you reason to care, because this CBA will be over before we know it, and we'll be hopefully not covering another work stoppage, or I need to answer some questions. And there are plenty today. PFT PM posse. Do you think the NFL's oligarchs could have slipped one by the union and essentially planted Howell as executive director, since he seems to be more management than union? I don't think this was a Manchurian candidate situation. One of the things the NFLPA was trying very hard to do was make sure the league didn't know who the finalists were, so the league couldn't put a thumb on the scale. Now, did the league know? Did owners know? Did the commissioner know that Lloyd Howell was one of the finalists? I don't know. I don't think this was that. I know the NFLPA was very concerned about that. PFT PM posse, we are headed to a Willie Nelson concert tonight, and as you know, I'll have plenty of Chris Sims' favorite plant with me. Best concert you've been to, any advice, legal or otherwise, as we go to Willie in Dallas? I don't have any advice. I didn't know Willie Nelson was still touring. I'd say Willie Nelson is, and this is an example of someone who is still contributing to society on the wrong side of 80, something I aspire to do. And I've done the math. It's not that far off. It's 22 years away. Holy crap, that's depressing. But what can we do? As I've said before, we all got one ride. We all got one life. And we all live every year of that life. And our challenge is to get the absolute most out of the time we have. Man, that sounds so. I should be on a soapbox when I say that. All right, I have no advice for you. And the best concert I've ever been to, probably when I saw Kiss in 1996, when they got back together again, put the makeup back on with the original four members. That concert was, to me, the equivalent of stepping into a time machine and going back 20 years. That's what it felt like. And I've seen them several times since then, and it doesn't feel like that anymore. But at least in 1996, they still, with their makeup and their gear on, they looked like they did in the late 70s. That was the best one, because that was just a return of something I never thought would ever happen again, and a true feeling of rewinding the clock back by a couple of decades. One more. Well, you know what? I'm going to move on to others. PFT PM Posse, you get too many because you're at the top of the stack because I follow that account. Will Shaman. Would a running back clause be created in rookie contracts that activates after a back's second year and allows them to negotiate their second contract, activated by performance? For example, if you have 2,000-yard rushing in 2 years, you're eligible for an extension after 2 years. It's all something that would have to be collectively bargained. Because currently, the way the rules are, you've got to have 3 years in as a drafted player to be able to renegotiate your contract. As an undrafted player, you got 2 years. But after 2 years, you've got no ability to become a free agent. You're an exclusive rights free agent, which is a fancy way of saying you're not a free agent. Your choices are re-sign with your current team, typically the exclusive rights tender, the 1 year minimum salary, or don't play. So it would all have to be solved through CBA negotiations. And that's what any solution that we could come up with. And I appreciate that folks are coming up with ideas, but any solution would have to be bargained by the league and the union. Jeremy Dodd, if you had a crystal ball, how do you see the next CBA negotiations going? I don't have a crystal ball. I have no idea. I have no idea what the union's objectives will be. I have no idea how Lloyd Howell is going to lead the union. I have no idea if he's even going to be the executive director the next time around. I don't know who the next commissioner will be. Presumably, Roger Goodell won't be the commissioner when these next CBA negotiations happen. So I can't even begin to speculate on what will happen with the next CBA negotiations. Andrew Skur, I realize it's not a solution to the entire problem, but do teams restrict access to gambling sites from their Wi-Fi networks within their own facilities? I don't know how it works when you've got an app. I don't know. I'd like to think they do, but you're right. It doesn't even begin to solve the problems. And the easiest way to solve the problem is make sure the players understand exactly what the rules are and comply with them. Valerian 12. What do you think happens first? Saudi Arabia is able to purchase an NFL team, or Saudi Arabia starts its own American Football League? Well, you need to know what they want to do. Where do they want to throw their money next? And if the NFL finds out that Saudi Arabian interests want to use some of that public investment fund money to buy an NFL team, they need to ask themselves, what happens if we say no? What happens if we shut them out? Would they create their own league? Would they compete with us for players? Would they play their games in football season on Saturdays when we can't via the broadcast antitrust exemption? Would they play on Sundays? Would they get better players? Would they spend more money than we spend? Is it better to partner with them than to compete with them? It all depends on what they want to do. But if they ever come sniffing around to buy a team, the league needs to think about what happens if they say no. And I've thought for years now. There was an article in Sports Illustrated about football in America. And one of the things I detected, it was a very long article, and I read most of it, I think. One of the things I detected is there's an appetite for football the way it used to be played. At least there was at the time. And I've wondered whether or not someone would create a football league that embraces the rules of the 80s and the 90s. Old school football. Rough and tumble, brutal. All the players know the risks. Everybody signs a waiver. You know you may get concussions. Morally, it's problematic. But you know what? If you can appeal to 30% of the audience, of the population, who would turn their back on the NFL as maybe too woke, and they'd go back and watch old school football where it's basically gladiators, there's an opportunity there. If someone wants to do it, if they have the money, and we know the public investment fund Definitely does. Roxanne, why doesn't the NFL use the 17th game as a neutral site game? Some of those massive college stadiums around the country could be utilized. There's a lot of potential and a football-hungry base in all these locations. I'm sure money is the answer, but it'd be a cool vibe if they did this. I said this from the moment they went to 17 games. It creates 16 neutral site games every year. Now we see a certain number of them being played in Europe and elsewhere, but the rest of them, it could be every team. Because right now what happens is every team in one conference plays 9 home games. Every team in the other conference plays 8 home games. And typically teams from the conference that play 9 home games give up one of their home games. The Jaguars give up a home game no matter whether or not they have 9 or 8. But for the neutral site games in other countries, it comes from, and I think this year it's going to be AFC teams. And it goes back and forth. Well, why not have everyone give up a home game from both conferences? There's a neutral site for every team. What would have been that 9th home game is a neutral site game. And I've suggested the University of Michigan Stadium, Notre Dame, Penn State, Texas, some of the massive college stadiums. Here's the problem. You'd have to equip the stadiums with the real-time communication cables to 345 Park Avenue. Is it worth it for one game a year? I don't know. And then you get into the question of, and I think Michigan is currently taking this up, alcohol sales at college sporting events. I remember back in 1998 when the Steelers and the Falcons played a preseason game in Morgantown. And I think Morgantown was being scouted as a potential alternate location for Pittsburgh Steelers home games while they built Heinz Field, depending upon whether there was a way to build the new stadium without also preventing Three Rivers Stadium from being utilized. What they ended up doing was building them right next to each other. But there was an issue about alcohol sales for that game. So that's part of it as well. So I think it'd be a great idea, but alcohol sales and the presence of the appropriate technology to allow for real-time replay review, that would be one of the challenges if the NFL would ever want to do it. I think they should. I agree. It's a great question, a great point. David Mitchell, what are the criteria for in-season Hard Knocks? We know the criteria for preseason Hard Knocks. I don't know. Now, for preseason Hard Knocks, you are exempt if you have a new head coach, if you've been to the playoffs in either of the last 2 seasons, or if you've done it in the last 10 years. For in-season, I think it's still too new. I think they're having an easy enough time finding volunteers to do it that they don't have to have criteria where they could tap someone on the shoulder and say, you have to do it. And I know they're in the process now as they look for a Hard Knocks team. They're trying to find an in-season team, and the Commanders are a candidate, I'm told, for either one. Not both, although both would be kind of interesting, but they're a candidate for either one. They want to get this sale finalized. The vote is tentatively set for July 20. They want to get the sale finalized before they pick the Commanders for anything. And at our last word, what we had heard earlier this week, the Jets bracing for an involuntary assignment to be the Hard Knocks team for the preseason. Not that they've been picked, not that they've been told, not that it's been reported or announced or anything like that. They're bracing for it. They fear that it's going to happen. We'll see if it does. Sam Eichenlob, hypothetical question. What are the chances the NFL ever comes back to St. Louis with an expansion team? Or did St. Louis ruin their best shot by taking the $800 million settlement in the lawsuit against the NFL? Yeah, there are hard feelings right now between the league and St. Louis. But what will happen is eventually there'll be enough of a change in leadership of the league. There'll be enough of a change in political leadership in St. Louis and Missouri to allow maybe the page to be turned. Because, look, the NFL is always looking for that other city out there that is willing to give a bunch of taxpayer money to build a stadium as the leverage against a team's inability to get taxpayer money in its own stadium. I thought this would be a bigger story this week. The acknowledgement from Erie County Executive Mark Poloncarz that it was a given. If they didn't get taxpayer money for the new Bills stadium, the Bills were moving. And maybe it's obvious. I don't think it's obvious to most fans. I think most fans don't want to think of it that way. But if you've got a team that is due for a new stadium or a massive renovation like in Jacksonville right now, and you're not going to kick in taxpayer money, either any or enough, you run the risk of that team going somewhere where they will kick in the money. So St. Louis could be a candidate. It could be a place that serves as the leverage for a couple of other cities before it gets a team at some point, or if there's an expansion team. Yeah. Another thing to keep in mind, though, and I may have mentioned this on this program. If not, I mean, I don't remember, so you probably don't remember either. But I think we could see smaller stadiums in the future, which opens up smaller markets for NFL teams. And I say that because I know of some owners who wonder whether or not it makes good financial sense to have an upper deck on their stadium. When you look at the revenue you get from that extra, I don't know how many thousand fit in the upper deck, 20, 30,000, the cost of having enough employees present to service the upper deck fans, how much money they spend relative to the money spent by the lower deck fans. I think that there's an argument to be made, or at least an analysis to be considered, as to whether it would be more profitable, as profitable, or almost as profitable to just dispense with the upper deck. So, boom, you could build a 40,000 seat stadium in a small market. Now, it would be pricey, but you can fill it up and you can make great return. And at the end of the day, what's it about now? What did we learn when the NFL decided to flex Thursday night games late in the season? The in-stadium experience is taking a backseat to the ability to flood millions of homes with primetime NFL content. So as long as it feels full and it feels exciting, it doesn't matter whether it's 40, 50, 70, 100. It doesn't matter as long as it's full and it feels like it's a big deal. It could be 20,000. If you build it the right way and you do the camera angles the right way, it doesn't matter. As long as all the seats are filled, it's a big deal. That's the implicit message. That's why they had the blackout rule for so long. They wanted to have full stadiums on TV so it feels like a bigger deal. So you understand why you're watching it. You don't want to tune into a game and see all these empty seats and ask yourself, why am I watching this? If nobody bothers to go to this game, why am I sitting here watching this? That's what they want. And you can do that with smaller stadiums. So anyway, that got us away from the St. Louis question. Back to that, I think in time, the feathers will unruffle because the names will change of the people involved on both sides of the equation. David Mitchell, DRS Mitch, did D. Smith play any part in selecting his replacement? Seems he should be screaming the loudest if the process wasn't followed. But the process was followed. The question is, was it a good process? They engineered a process that I think is not good, but they followed it. They followed it. So I think the reality is that in the aftermath of the 2020 CBA negotiations, which could have gone either way, which nearly resulted in the players rejecting the proposed agreement negotiated by DeMaurice Smith, that was essentially a vote of no confidence. And I think that's when the clock started ticking on him moving on. When you come that close to failure to ratify the CBA that you have proposed to the players, that's when it's time to start thinking about your next step in your career. Daniel Kunamoto, do you think the XFL or the USFL will be used by the Players Association as a bargaining tool? As in, we will strike the NFL and play over there if you don't give us what we want. Well, one problem is they don't play during football season. So it's not exactly a great threat. They'll shut down the NFL season and then go play in the XFL or the USFL in the spring. Here's the bigger issue, and this is the true nuclear option that the union would have to balance the NFL nuclear option. The NFL nuclear option is players go out on strike and we hire replacements. We saw that in 1987. Player nuclear option is we go on strike or they lock us out and we start our own league and we do our own TV deal and we bring NFL players into your home. But that would take a ton of money to plan. It would require broadcast partners who are willing to forever burn their ability to consider doing business with the NFL for a possibility. Because the greater that plan is put in place, the more it's ready to go, where all you have to do is flip the switch. That makes it likely you're never going to have to use it. If they truly build the nuclear missile, they'll never have to use it. But you can't build the missile because the people who are involved in being your partners for broadcasting those games want the missile to fire. They're not going to forfeit their ability to potentially do business with the NFL to help you have a missile in your silo that just helps you continue to get your best possible deal with the NFL. So that would be the best way for the players to counter the full bargaining power of the league, but it's never going to happen. Let's see what else is here. I got to wrap this up. Burn unit, important question. Will there be a nice fatty ribeye fired up on your badass grill to celebrate the completion of your physical? I smoked a big-ass cigar last night to celebrate the completion of my physical, and I enjoyed it. And that leads to the question from Local Hero. Did you honestly tell your doctor how many drinks you have per week? Now, I've had this conversation with my doctor. I drink in moderation, and I smoke cigars in moderation as a way to deal with stress. I have Crohn's disease, and there are moments where it feels like there's an ice pick stuck in my descending colon. And frankly, I'm dealing with that currently. There's been some stress this week with the turnover of the site and the complaints, and I've been kind of at the center of the storm of various different concerns and issues. And I won't bore you with the details, but it's been a stressful week. And when I'm under stress, it starts to manifest in pain in my colon where I have inflammatory bowel disease. I light up a cigar, it's gone. It's gone. 5 minutes, it's gone. So my doctor knows that. My doctor knows I have a couple of drinks most nights. I rarely, if ever, get drunk. I rarely, if ever, even feel it. So he knows. And I went a long period of my life where I didn't drink at all. So I'm kind of using that as my, I had like 25 years where I rarely drank. I didn't even want to. I got a lot of years where I never smoked a cigar. So as we coast into the golden years, and I know something's going to get me anyway, maybe the bear that's still roaming the hillside. I'm very big on enjoying your life. And look, whatever you do it in moderation. I'll smoke a cigar every other day or every third day. And during football season, it's harder because I'll be on the road. And I don't feel like a compulsion. Like right now, I don't want to sit here and smoke a cigar while I do this. I love that AJ Hawk does it on Pat McAfee's show, but I just don't have the desire to do it. I like going down to my barn. I like opening my laptop and writing some more fiction for novels, not for the usual stuff that I write on PFT, although some of you would say it's fiction. I like having a couple of drinks. I'll play a little golden tea, and then I'll come back up to the house. That's what I like to do. That helps me get grounded after a long day of dealing with this job that I have. It really isn't a job, but it's felt like a job this week because we're still trying to make the best possible experience for you at PFT as we ensure that the new and improved PFT is truly improved. And there can be improvements to the improvements, and we're trying to make it as good as it can be. A couple more real quick before we go. Let's see. King 36, do you see any coach currently on the hot seat who might get fired mid-season if they get off to a slow start? Well, there will be teams that get off to a slow start. And yeah, there are teams where the coach is going into the year definitely on the hot seat. I think in Cleveland, Kevin Stefanski needs to be worried. He's not flaming hot seat, but if this Deshaun Watson thing ends up being a disaster, if they can't get anything positive out of Deshaun Watson by the middle of the season, he needs to be concerned. And we have an owner there that we've seen fire a guy in the middle of the season. So we know that capacity exists. Chargers, if the Justin Herbert year 4 doesn't really work and they're losing in ugly fashion and they're 1-6 through 7 games, yeah, that's a possibility for Brandon Staley to be gone midseason. There are several teams. If you really sit down and think about it, at 0-0, it's great. Once you start racking up those losses, then the pressure gets put on ownership. And then the question becomes, will ownership stand firm behind the coach, or will they give in? Will we see what Jim Irsay did last year when Colts really weren't all that bad, but he just reached his limit, and I think he was determined to see what Jeff Saturday would do as an interim coach. So I think there are plenty of coaches. If things go sufficiently sideways right out of the gates, they could be worrying by the time Halloween rolls around. Fishman WVU, if Eric Bieniemy has a good season with Washington on his own, do you think he'll be a good head coaching candidate next year, or has he been blackballed for some reason? I think that he took the job in Washington because he recognized if he's ever going to have a chance to be an NFL head coach, he needs to go to a team without an Andy Reid as the head coach. And he picked a team with a defensive head coach. He needs to go there. He needs to run the offense well. That's the only way he's ever going to stand out. And we'll know if the offense goes well in Washington and he doesn't get a head coaching job, that's when we say something else is going on here. Because no longer can anyone say, well, it's all Andy Reid. Now, never mind the fact that Doug Peterson was in that same job and became a head coach with two different teams. Matt Nagy was in that job and became head coach of the Bears and was coach of the year his first season in Chicago. All of a sudden, that pipeline ended with Eric Bieniemy. If he goes to Washington and that offense is great with Sam Howell at quarterback, or Jacoby Brissett if it turns out being Brissett, and Bieniemy doesn't get a head coaching job, something fishy is going on. All right, let's see what else we have here. One more from Tom. If Brian Flores didn't have big plans for Danielle Hunter being in his defense, do you believe Hunter would have been traded by now? What would the Vikings defense look like if their best pass rusher were to be traded? Well, they've already traded Zadarius Smith, who had double-digit sacks last year. And Hunter did as well. And my argument's been defense isn't going to be any worse without Danielle Hunter or any of the players from last year. Brian Flores alone is going to make the defense better than it was last year. The scheme was bad last year. The question is, can they make Danielle Hunter happy with his $5.5 million compensation package? He wants more. So I don't think it's about trading him. It's about paying him. Are they going to pay him? Do they see the necessity in paying him? Is their attitude, hey, you play for us, you play for no one. We'll play hardball with you. If you're not happy with your contract, sit out. But you're going to be fined. And you're not going to get any closer to free agency if you sit out the whole year. So I feel like the Vikings have been patient where they can be. They were ready to move on from Dalvin Cook. They were patient. They were ready to move on from Zadarius Smith. They were patient. Being patient with Danielle Hunter. Maybe they will eventually trade him, and maybe they'll just wait for an injury to a pass rusher with another team to open up a trade market for Danielle Hunter. We'll see how it plays out. All right, that's it for today. Went over an hour, but I wanted to make up a little bit for yesterday. Missing PFT PM. We're 9 out of 10. That's a 90. Is that still an A somewhere? I don't know. We'll be back Monday, I think, unless it's a company holiday. Tuesday is the 4th of July. We won't do it then. Definitely by Wednesday. Definitely on Wednesday. Definitely Wednesday for PFT PM. But absolutely, without question, around the clock at ProFootballTalk.com. Thanks, as always, for some of your time. We'll see you again here real soon. Hi, it's Mike Florio. Thanks for watching PFT on YouTube. Hit subscribe for the latest news and analysis from Pro Football Talk.